Hello YouTube, this is the Plastic Commando coming to you from deep behind enemy lines, and this is a continuation video in the process of introducing alternate infantry, alternate miniatures, in this case infantry, into your Axis and Allies World War I 1914 board game. If you have seen from my previous videos, I've introduced the steps that I've taken to not only introduce the alternate miniatures, but to prep those, to get those ready to prime, and ultimately what we're doing today is getting these painted in appropriate colors that will go along with the color schemes of the board game itself. And as you can see, we've already started on a few of these miniatures. Of course, we've got some the American infantry, which I have started painting with a typical American color, olive drab. And as you see over here, we've got a few Frenchmen, which I'm going to be putting in as alternate infantry as well, to supplement the out-of-box versions. And then over here we have some alternate Russian infantry, which again I have started painting with a lighter shade of brown. And of course here we have the alternate Germans. And then over here to the left we've got the Turkish infantry. And then of course we've got a few guys here ready for their turn to be painted as well. These are the ones that we had primed in the last video. Now I'd like to talk just briefly about the paints which I'm using to complete this process. We've got over here to the left hand side, for the French I'm using the Tamiya color, which is essentially just a bright blue. It matches really well with the out-of-box infantry. And then next we've got Tester's spray enamel, and this is it's a gloss green. It's a very bright green, but it does match pretty well the out-of-box color of the Austrian infantry. It's a bit brighter, shinier than I prefer. But again, after this video and of the painting process, you'll see I'm going to actually be sealing these miniatures in a polyurethane, and then once that dries I'll follow it with a Matt Varnish. So any shine that is on these miniatures at this time will be taken off, and they'll blend in really nicely. So I'm not too concerned with the gloss color, the shininess of the paint at this time. And for the Turkish infantry, it's very hard trying to find a color that was what I consider to be more of a military shade, but also that matched in similarity to an out-of-box set of miniatures from 1914. But I did find this is actually an aircraft color from Tamiya. It's one of their Tamiya aircraft series, and it's a dark green, and in my opinion it does match really well with the out-of-box miniatures themselves. Maybe on the video it's slightly darker, but again I think it does match pretty well with the out-of-box miniatures. And then of course, just to finish up here in the middle, I'm using an Army Painter, and I have to say I really do like the Army Painter paints, not only the spray but the individual paints as well. I just think that they are excellent quality paint. But in this case I did happen to have a rather large spray can of leather brown, and this is of course the color that I'm using for the Russian infantry, and that's going to look really nice, in particular after these dry. And we use a polyurethane to add some shading, and then ultimately spray a matte varnish, these are going to look really good. Of course, then we've got the Tamiya just basic olive drab 2, and that's what I'm using for the American infantry. And then lastly, for the German infantry, I'm using a Model Master gunship gray. And in my opinion, the gunship gray really does match the out-of-box color very well. The olive drab color that I'm using for the American infantry is actually a bit lighter than the out-of-box American infantry, but that's okay, because in future videos you'll likely see, once I actually get to the board gaming, you're going to see that even with some of the out-of-box miniatures, I'm actually redoing those as well, and my American infantry will be painted in the olive drab that you're seeing before us right now. Was not too satisfied with some of the out-of-box colors that came with the board game. In particular, I thought the American infantry was a bit too dark, and the Italian infantry, in my opinion, looked a bit too much orange, I guess, and maybe mirrored the Japanese infantry in the basic Axis and Allies game as well. So I'm going to be, again, showing in a later video what I'm doing to change some of the color schemes of the out-of-box infantry. And of course, we've got the French here as well, which I've shown. So just wanted to kind of show the colors that I'm using to get the miniatures painted after we had primed those, and then I'm going to continue on to complete the painting of these miniatures today, and then we're going to have to let those dry for a good 12 to 18 hours depending on your temperature, but I would recommend at least a good 12 hours before we get to a process of adding any sort of polyurethane. And so I'm going to finish these up, and we're going to go ahead and get those taken care of as soon as possible. All right, just real quick, sometimes in football, when you see a play that's going to perhaps be a little more successful for you or achieve what you're trying to do on the field, you call an audible. And that's what I've done with the French miniatures, which I'm introducing into my Axis and Allies 1914 game. Really wasn't satisfied with that dark blue color for what I intend to do. Once these dry, as I've indicated, I want to apply a polyurethane shade that will not only harden these miniatures for gameplay, but also provide a bit of a shade, if you will, to the paint and appearance. And I got to thinking, it looked to me as if with the dark blue, it was really so dark that the shade effect, in my opinion, would not really have been that noticeable, and it actually may have made them even darker. So I've called an audible, and what I've used, I actually went to my local hobby store, and I did find a lighter shade of blue. And you know, interesting enough, it is French blue. So what I plan to do with this lighter shade is, of course, when I apply the polyurethane shade, which you'll see next, you're going to see the darker highlights within the creases of the sculpts and the miniatures. And I think for what I'm trying to achieve, this will work out better with a lighter color than applying a darker shade of polyurethane, which you'll see. However, if you know, if you're watching this video and you want to basically paint your miniatures and skip the poly shade, I would still recommend that you seal the miniature with perhaps a spray of Matt Varnish. However, if you want to use the prior dark blue that I had shown in the video, it does match really well with the out-of-box miniature, and so I would recommend that particular color. However, again, I'm going to use a lighter shade of blue for these guys, just because I think it'll achieve a little bit better effect of what I'm trying to do, and that's again provide a shade of polyurethane onto the miniature. So just wanted to show you that real quick. And again, we called an audible on the colors, and sometimes in life you just have to do that, and also with hobbies. If you don't like what you're doing, then stop and redo it and move ahead before you do them all the same color and then realize you just made a mistake. So good thing I caught that early. All right, we are now ready for the applying of the polyurethane shading, and I'm going to go ahead and I've already got things kind of organized and ready to go. So what I'd like to do is kind of take you through the first few steps of this process of applying the shade, and then getting those ready ultimately to once they dry properly in the amount of time needed to go ahead and then later apply a matte varnish to go ahead and finish off the figures, and then we'll go ahead and proceed to getting these little guys on the game board. Now, for purposes of video today, I have already went through and shaded quite a number of these guys that you've seen in the previous video. But I do want to take a little bit of time today and just again kind of go through this process of what it takes to get the shading applied, and then ultimately the matte varnish. Go ahead and move my drink out of the way. And for starters, and I've got this lid off, so I'm going to be a little extra careful. I'm using Army Painter Quick Shade. It's the soft tone, and I really like Army Painter, not only their paints, but this Quick Shade soft tone is just amazing. Again, I do a lot of painting of various type miniatures at various scales, and this is just an outstanding way of shading your miniatures in various forms, and the results are just excellent. I mean, I can't say enough about Army Painter Quick Shade. I just love this, and the soft tone is my preference. This is the softer of the three tones that Army Painter does have, and this one is really good, and this is what I'm using for the alternative Axis and Allies miniatures for 1914. So I've got a few guys ahead, and I've started on one guy at this point in time, and this is one of the Austrian infantry, which has already been pre-painted, and there's been ample enough time for the paint to dry and cure. So now we're going to go ahead and apply some shade. Now I've previously stirred this. You want to make sure that you have the Army Painter Quick Shade stirred really well. When it sits on the shelf, it has a tendency to clump up at the bottom, and I have spent a good amount of time previously stirring this for purposes of the video, and I think it's good also as you're applying the shade, especially if you're doing an enormous amount of miniatures at once. You want to go ahead and keep that stirred at various intervals. So what I like to do is just start with well, let me back up. There's two ways of actually applying the shade. Some people prefer to actually take the miniature and dip the miniature down into the shade. If you do that, it's better to use a pair of tweezers for the small bases that we've got. Otherwise, you're going to get the shade all over your fingers. But what I find, though, beneficial, in particular more for smaller miniatures, is to actually apply with just an old brush or a very cheap brush that's not going to cost you a lot of money. The reason being is when you go dip the miniatures into the shade, you can get a lot of shade, a lot of polyurethane. It's going to pool really bad. So you're going to have to spend some time either trying to shake that off, either try to wipe it off. But then even at that point, you don't necessarily get all the particular shading that you might want to like. So I do recommend brushing it on. It's just my preference. You know, everybody has a different way of doing it, but I do like to brush it on. And most of my brushes aren't really old brushes because I take very good care of my more expensive brushes. What I typically use is just a very, it's testers, but it's the very cheap introductory grade brushes. Because once you use the brush to paint it on, you've essentially destroyed the brush. There's no point in trying to clean this off. This is polyurethane. You might try some distilled spirits, but that's why I prefer just a very cheap brush to go ahead and apply this wash and then just throw the brush away. And as you see here, I picked up, this is actually a 3-pack originally. Got it from Hobby Lobby for $1.99. Again, I like Hobby Lobby. You can get a 40% coupon off online every time you go in. So I bought multiple packs of these at one time just for purposes of doing shading and a few other things that I do in my hobbies. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and dip this shade in. And I do recommend finding an area like maybe the tip of a gun that is easier to hold, and that way you can apply the most effective shading to the miniature. So we're going to go ahead and start applying a generous coat to make sure we get all of the shading kind of in the nooks and the crannies. I'm going to flip him over very gently. And I hope I'm getting a lot of this on the video so you can see okay. Go ahead and get a little bit on his legs as well. And I'll tell you, one of the things I like to do when I'm painting these miniatures with stands, I will go ahead and do the body of the miniature. And then in order for this polyurethane to cure, you're talking about, we need to let it set for about 24, sometimes depending on the humidity or temperature, where you've got it stored at, maybe 24 to 48 hours before this polyurethane is really going to cure hard and be ready to then apply matte varnish. So what I like to do is I go ahead and brush on just enough on the miniature itself for that process, saving the bottom of the miniature itself, because we don't want to apply the whole miniature with stain, shade in this case, and then go to set it down, because what can happen is if you've got polyurethane on the bottom, it will start to get sticky as it dries, and you go to put it on cardboard, paper. I have seen at times it actually sticks and it can cause a big mess. So I do like to leave that open, and then once it cures, then I'm able to handle the miniature itself. I'll go back and do the bottom of the miniature, let that dry for a period of time, and then move on to the matte varnish. So we're going ahead and finishing this one up. He's got a generous amount of shade in all the crevices of the uniform, and on the stand itself, just on the top part. So that way later we can go ahead and come back to this guy. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and carefully set this one down, and then we'll go on to the Frenchman. And I'm really glad I changed the color on these guys, because this soft tone army shade does work really well on lighter colors, and you'll be able to see a lot more of the shade itself working into the crevices of this miniature. And I know some of you guys might be thinking too, you know, you've taken the time to paint all these miniatures into a nice bright color, and it looks like that I'm actually applying this shade and I'm ruining the miniature itself. They are going to look perhaps muddy once you're doing this process, but trust me, once you actually get the miniature shaded and it dries and cures, it's going to look, over a period of 24 to 48 hours, it's going to start looking really good. The purpose of the shade is to give you more or less a shadow effect in the crevices of the miniature, the face, the uniform, and it's going to start looking really good over the drying period of time. And then ultimately, to complement, like I said, we're going to do the matte varnish, which will take off any sort of shine that might be present on the miniature itself, and kind of even out some of the lines and the tone of this shade. So we've got a good amount of shade on this guy. and you can always take a little bit of the excess off of your brush. And I do recommend when you're brushing, start from the head and work your way down the miniature to take off any bit of shade that might be trying to pull in a crevice, because once this does dry, if you have left some of the polyurethane pooling in spots that is more than what you wanted, it's about too late once it dries. So we want to try to get that off as much as possible. All right. So we're gonna go ahead and let this guy take a break. And like I said, I'm going to come back later. We'll do the bottom of that stand, and I'm going to put him over here to dry. Now, just real quick, and I'm only doing a few of these. I've not found any suitable alternative Italian infantry that I want to put into the game, but this is one of the out-of-box miniatures for the Italians, and I have underwent the same process on these guys, getting them ready, prepping, priming, and then ultimately painting. I've chosen a different, more richer brown color that's better, I think, than the out-of-box color that came with these guys. I never was a big fan. It was just a bit too much orange, and so I've actually painted these, and I'm actually doing the same step as well. We're going to apply shading and bring out the highlights of the sculpt and the uniform. And these, as I've mentioned before, I really like these out-of-box sculpts. The fact that I'm introducing alternate miniatures into the game, it has no bearing whatsoever on the poor quality of these miniatures. I just like variety on the game board. But I have to say, I really do like all of these sculpts that came out of box with Axis and Allies 1914. And you can see the shade is going on really well with this color. Alrighty, there we go. I'm going to go ahead just in a bit, get a bit of the top part of the base. There we go. And like I said, we'll come back and get the rest of that base later. And just to kind of give an overview, make sure there's no pooling. All right, that looks good. Okay, I'll get to the rest of these later. And just wanted to kind of go through the different steps of what I do to go ahead and apply the polyurethane shade. And once this cures and dries over 24 to 48 hours, it will make the miniature a bit more sturdy, a bit more hard in terms of durability, being able to handle a miniature frequently, as will be the case in gameplay. So you want every sort of protection you can put on a miniature. And I would note also that, again, if you're not interested in doing this step, if you're watching the video and you're not interested really in applying a darker shade, you don't like it, that's totally fine. If you do end up painting the miniatures though, I would recommend putting either a clear polyurethane on. You can go to a local hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, or even applying a polyurethane spray of some sort. But I would recommend sealing the miniature if you try to paint it, because multiple handling will eventually crack and cause some damage to your paint on the miniature. So, okay, this has just been a quick overview of the using the soft tone and applying the shade. And again, you can see some of the figures here, which I don't want to handle again because they are drying. Right. Okay, I'm back. Just realized actually, and I was afraid that maybe some of these guys, when I was applying the poly shade, quick shade, was out of focus, off camera, and I do apologize. Again, this is my first venture into YouTube, so bear with me. But I did want to kind of readjust the camera a little bit. We are done with the quick shade applying, and what I wanted to kind of show you though, these are some that I've already applied a shade to, and I wanted to kind of bring these to the camera if I could. I realized in going back and looking at some of the video, the entire part of this segment was off camera, so it was of no benefit. What we've got here, we've got one of the alternative Russian infantry, and I had applied the quick shade polyurethane to this guy. It's about 36 hours ago approximately, and he's very dried, and so he's ready to apply matte varnish to. And you can see, I can get it into focus here really good, you can see the detail of this miniature. Just love that pose. He's getting ready to toss a grenade, I'm sure, at the Hun, who is charging with a bayonet at this point. But you can see how the quick shade has went into the crevices. It brings out a lot of highlight and shadow effect of this miniature, and it just looks really good. And once that matte varnish is applied and it dries, the miniature is going to look outstanding. And you can kind of get an idea of these miniatures as we're progressing forward that's already had the shade applied. This is an example of one of the out-of-box Italians, which I had just applied some shade to. This is one that I've already applied shade to. It is dried effectively, and you can see the detail in the crevices, the shadow effect of this one. So I just want to kind of show you that real quick. And then also the quick shade polyurethane does work well with out-of-box artillery, which you can see I've applied to this piece. Again, you can see from the camera there's a sort of a semi-gloss to glossy effect on the miniature since the polyurethane has dried, and that's again the whole purpose of this matte varnish. We're gonna get all that shine off, so you won't be able to see a shine that makes your miniature piece look almost wet, if you will. So we're going to get that taken off. And then just real quick before we get to that process, this is also a tank which I am introducing into my Italian army for Axis and Allies 1914. This tank is actually available on shapeways.com. It's through Historical Board Gaming. It's an Italian Fiat tank, and it's a big box, but that's basically how a lot of these tanks were in World War I. But it's a cool looking tank, I think, and you can see I've already again applied a generous amount of the polyurethane quick shade. It's obviously dried. This has been applied roughly about 36 hours ago, and it's very dried at this point, so it's ready for some matte varnish. And I'll have in a future video, you'll see as I present some of the armies, and you perhaps see them on the game boards, you're going to see some of these alternate tanks which I'm going to be putting into battle. But I just want to show you this one real quick because it already has the shading applied to it. So just wanted to show you that maybe as a bit of a teaser, but we'll dive into the tanks later. So what I'd like to do real quick on this one is just to kind of give you a very quick overview of what I'll be doing to apply the matte varnish. And for what we're going to be using for this process is Army Painter. Again, it's an anti-shine, it's a matte varnish, and again, I just love their products. I'm not getting paid by Army Painter, but I just really love their products, and this matte varnish works out really well for all kinds of projects and miniatures and plastics, as well as sealing. Even if you have metal miniatures, figures that you paint, this does a really good job on the last part of the process. So I want to kind of go through this just real quick. This is what I'll be using, and when you're applying the matte varnish, you don't want to spray a significant amount. You just want to go in very light layers, a few bursts, let that dry, flip the miniature over, again a few light bursts, and then that should give you enough coverage of the miniature. Maybe even later set it up on top, spray down, and that'll pretty well cover everything you need on the miniature. So the purpose, you don't want to spray a significant amount up front, because if you get too much, you can actually have a yellowing effect at times depending on the color of the miniature, and that's something that you want to avoid. So I'm going to lay a few of these miniatures down. This is one of the American Commanders. Not certain if the camera's picking up well, but you can see how the shade has got into the crevices of this little fella, and it's turned out really nice. So again, we're going to put some Matt Varnish anti-shine on this miniature, and we've got a German miniature. Again, these have already been shaded and ready to go for today on the Matt Varnish, and the same with Turkish infantry. So we'll go ahead and apply these down. I'm going to grab my mask real quick so as not to breathe in any fumes. And I hope the audio was satisfactory. At least we got the video down pat this time. So what we'll do is we're just going to apply a few coats, starting from left to right on each miniature. Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. I would rather take several steps to apply the matte varnish, as opposed to thinking I missed a spot, which I did miss a little bit of this guy's head, but I don't want to keep spraying and then cause a significant amount of varnish to apply to the miniature, and then perhaps when it dries it's not going to look as well. So you can tell, I don't know if maybe it's hard to tell, but I'm going to try to zoom in a bit on some of the miniatures. You might be able to tell a bit of the contrast of the color, but they are starting to get that matte look. That shine is slowly disappearing. And I'm going to leave these guys laying for maybe about 15 minutes or so, and that's usually time enough to handle to where you can flip them over. It takes that stickiness effect off, and apply another coat. And again, like with the poly shade steps, I like to try to keep the last step of the base last, so I can stand the miniature up and let everything dry effectively. And then at some point I'll go back and I'll pop a spray on each one of the bottom bases to make sure the miniature is fully sealed. Okay, I think that's going to bring this video to a conclusion. I want to say I do appreciate those that have viewed not only this video but the prior video. I hope that this has all been very helpful, this process of understanding how to take alternate miniatures that are just bare plastic, free of any color, and get those prepped and ready, primered, ultimately painted, and then sealed with polyurethane shade, and then with the last step being applying the Army Painter anti-shine. So once we get this process and the rest of these are completed with the anti-shine, these guys are game ready and they'll be on the battle board. And I appreciate each and every one of you for watching this video. I encourage and welcome any comments that you may have or questions. I will certainly respond to those in a timely manner. And if you haven't done so, I would encourage each of you to subscribe to my channel. These introductory videos have just been a means of introducing myself and of course my love of painting miniatures. But I do plan future videos, not only with emphasis on game pieces, miniatures, as it relates to Axis and Allies games, whether it be World War II, World War I, but also perhaps some strategy videos, and ultimately some gameplay as well. So I would encourage each of you to subscribe, hit that subscribe button to the channel, and we'll be having videos in the future on various topics as it relates to Axis and Allies 1914 and Global 1940. So I appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in. This is the Plastic Commando, and I am over and out. Have a good day.